The bunker as a death trap. It wasn't just the artillery overhead or the Soviet tanks pushing deeper into Berlin that made conditions inside the Führerbunker unbearable. A quieter and inescapable danger came from the very air the occupants were breathing. Built beneath the Reich Chancellery to endure bombardment, the structure's defenses against explosions were solid. But by the last week of April 1945, its critical systems were faltering. Survivor testimony and later engineering analyses, supported by archival reports, confirmed that the ventilation was badly compromised by bomb damage. The diesel generators running below filled passageways with fumes, while smoke from burning debris above filtered downward through damaged ducts. Accounts long dismissed as exaggerations, complaints about the stench, headaches, and sleeplessness matched what we now know about those failing systems. By April 29th, conditions were worsening quickly. Contemporary and later medical assessments, combined with survivors' recollections, strongly suggest that air quality had degraded enough to affect cognition. Symptoms described included stinging eyes, dizziness, nausea, and a disorienting mental haze. Those confined to the underground spaces often assumed their suffering came from exhaustion or nerves, but the environment was clearly amplifying the strain. Even in what was designed as the most secure shelter in Berlin, the atmosphere itself was making people unwell. The atmosphere is important to picture since it frames what actually unfolded during those final hours. The bunker was overcrowded. Soldiers, aides, secretaries, and officials pressed into narrow spaces. The stale air carried the smell of diesel, sweat, and smoke. Improvised lighting often flickered, powered by overworked generators that could not reliably handle the demand. The deeper a person went, the heavier the atmosphere became. Claustrophobia mixed with fatigue, and silence was often broken by coughing or muttered complaints. This supposed fortress against destruction was instead sealing its residents into a slow decline. The physical effects were subtle but cumulative. Witnesses later described sluggishness, as if a fog dulled their focus even when assignments demanded precision. Messages were mistyped, simple questions forgotten, and judgment clouded. Few dared to voice the true extent of their distress, anxious that suggestions of weakness could be taken for disloyalty. Later diaries referenced aching heads, nausea after eating, and joints that throbbed despite food rations remaining constant. Some remembered fainting without warning. The mechanics of the problem were hidden. Engineers who might have explained the crisis were gone, leaving people to endure without knowing they were breathing a toxic blend every hour of the day. For Hitler, this was not simply discomfort. His health was already weakened by years of medication and recent treatments that included amphetamines and eye drops, all documented by witnesses and later forensic discussion. Combined with meager oxygen, diesel fumes, and rising stress, the result may have deepened his instability. His body was showing strain. Witnesses noted his slower movements and reliance on furniture for support. His thinking, too, grew more erratic, as paranoia escalated faster than the military developments alone might explain. Modern scholars stress that the bunker's air acted as one more accelerant, pushing an unwell man into a distorted mental state. This re-evaluation matters because survivor testimony long underplayed the role of air quality. Many remembered bombardment, fear, or betrayal, but not the subtler influence of the sealed space itself. Yet medical knowledge today makes plain that inhaling emissions from generators in poor ventilation can sap energy, worsen mood, and impair decision-making. Tie this to eyewitness reports of Hitler speaking of betrayal by those right beside him, and one sees how the poisoned atmosphere could have sharpened paranoia while blunting rational thought. That perspective reshapes how we think about conversations in those hours. Anger directed at secretaries, abrupt accusations against loyal aides, and furious critiques of military staff may not have come solely from desperation about the collapsing front. They can be read as outbursts reinforced by an environment quietly reducing his ability to reason clearly. Carbon monoxide and fumes cannot be measured after the fact, but symptoms align with what such exposure creates. It was not just ideology and drugs shaping his end. but the polluted air that trapped him inside his supposed safe haven. The structure itself played a cruel role in this transformation. The bunker had been celebrated for its strength, several meters of concrete, interlocking chambers, blast doors. But that same isolation meant there were no windows, no sunlight, no possibility of fresh air once ventilation faltered. The more hours spent inside, the more the atmosphere thickened. The claustrophobic mix hit younger staff hardest. Secretaries in their 20s remembered fainting at their work or vomiting in corners, yet staying silent out of fear. Military officers pushed through their duties, storing up migraines and exhaustion that only amplified mistakes. These technical factors shift the narrative. The final command post of the Third Reich was not the calm center from which Hitler directed events until the last moment. It was a place that eroded everyone's strength and composure. The sense of airlessness fed anxiety. Anxiety, in turn, deepened the sense of suffocation, and this cycle magnified the collapse of morale. What unfolded in those last nights was not only ideological frenzy, but a physical environment assaulting its inhabitants with every breath. The image that emerges is of a space that became its own form of entrapment. The walls kept bombs at bay, but they also slowly poisoned the people within. Movements slowed, tempers flared, thoughts fogged. A dictator's collapse was sped along by the invisible assault of his surroundings, which betrayed him as surely as any military reversal outside. And while the choking atmosphere dominated those days, not every story inside the bunker was defined by physical decline alone. Amid the suffocation and confusion, some were making deliberate choices about how they wanted to be remembered. Eva Braun's final routine. For Eva Braun, the final hours did not mean fading into the background. She was not simply an ornament in Hitler's shadow. Recently published personal accounts and archival letters in Germany, alongside testimony from witnesses such as Traudl Jung, have prompted historians to reconsider her role. These sources suggest that Braun engaged directly with her surroundings, making choices about clothing, personal belongings, and her appearance. In those cramped rooms, as Soviet forces closed in, she presented herself with deliberation rather than passivity. Testimony recalls her sorting through clothes, asking others to help, and directing which garments should be kept and which should be destroyed. Items once associated with her life beside Hitler, dresses, shoes, photographs, were no longer treated as tokens of status. They had become dangerous reminders, objects that could be seized and wielded as propaganda. Witnesses remembered that Braun took care to see them disposed of, either burned or buried, so they would not fall into Soviet hands. These choices were not casual. They reveal a woman calculating how much of her personal world could be eliminated before it was turned against her memory. The act of deciding what to erase went hand in hand with how she prepared herself to be seen. Jung and other attendants later remembered that Braun asked for a dress she had set aside, one she wished to wear on her last day. To them, this seemed striking, not because of vanity, but because it indicated she wanted to determine her appearance even in death. In surrounding testimony, small details linger: a collar straightened, hair arranged, manner calm. Historians analyzing these recollections emphasize the importance of agency. She was not aimless or indifferent. She made conscious choices, down to selecting which dress would frame her final image. Accounts also describe the atmosphere she cultivated. Others in the bunker were unsteady, exhausted, and unsettled by the failing systems and constant artillery fire. Braun, by contrast, displayed a steady composure. Secretaries and aides remembered that she remained calm when speaking to them, encouraging dignity in the face of destruction. Her behavior was deliberate, restrained posture, even tone, outward steadiness. Witnesses described it as unsettling precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the breakdown happening around her. When Hitler descended into rants about betrayal, or when senior officials argued over fragments of military news, Braun's behavior seemed measured, even rehearsed. Rather than interpreting this as mere detachment, historians point toward the way she asserted control over her final hours. While she had no influence on the war outside, she retained influence over how she would be remembered. Personal notes and lingering testimony include references to her concern with impression and appearance in history. In the middle of chaos, she focused on the image she would leave behind. She was preparing not only herself, but also how the memory of her presence might be carried out of the bunker by those who survived. This reframes Braun from the passive figure she was long assumed to be. Accounts of her last day show a woman setting the stage for her own ending. She had clothing arranged, possessions chosen for destruction, attendants instructed. She presented herself in a tailored dress, not a worn set of daily clothes. Far from trivial, these details mattered to her sense of identity. She would not step into memory as a frightened bystander. She would, at least in her own measure, choose the terms. Those who watched her at close range remembered the contrast. They recalled men around Hitler scribbling notes in confusion, drafting half-burned documents, contradicting one another in panic. Orders clashed and papers smoldered unfinished. Against that frenetic disorder, Braun stood out. Where their actions reflected disintegration, hers looked structured. Where their gestures betrayed collapse, hers suggested discipline. In this way, she even provided a kind of informal model to the women serving nearby, showing them how to carry themselves to the very end. Many of these memories persisted long after the war ended. Secretaries who testified decades later seemed still struck by the image she projected. They described the bunker rooms with detail, concrete walls, stains, smoke, and fumes, yet they always noted her calmness. That contrast made her presence feel staged, but it was also real. The calculated presentation aligned with her decisions about personal items and clothing. Taken together, these fragments point to purposeful preparation rather than unthinking compliance. Her choices carried into the way she met her death. Witnesses noted that she received cyanide, and discussions around its use were not hidden. People in the bunker spoke of it openly by the final day. Braun's decision to take it alongside Hitler was not sudden or forced, but accepted and prepared for in advance. Attendants did not describe a frantic final scene. They recalled instead a woman who had already made her peace, who had shaped her immediate environment, and who took steps to close her life in a way that fit her design. Viewed in this light, Eva Braun's routine in those final hours becomes less a question of devotion alone and more a statement of control. It was not about influencing events outside the walls, because those were irretrievable, but about influencing how she entered into memory. Down to the smallest gestures, she curated her own final frame. This perspective requires us to shift how we view the closing hours inside the bunker. Not only Hitler's collapse defined that space. Alongside him was a partner who acted deliberately, preparing her own end in carefully considered steps. She shaped her image with tidy authority, while others struggled to hold onto a collapsing order. Other members of Hitler's inner circle would later describe this period too, but from different viewpoints. Their recollections did not center on composure, but on what they witnessed as evidence was destroyed, identities erased, and memories shaped. One of those witnesses, who survived long after the others, offered testimony that gives an even more detailed account of what was removed and why. His words would open a clearer window into what these final preparations truly meant. The bodyguard who saw it all. Rochus Misch, Hitler's bodyguard and telephone operator, outlived almost everyone else who had been inside the Führerbunker during those last days. When he died in 2013, he left behind decades of interviews and public testimony that historians in the 2010s and 2020s revisited with fresh attention. Misch often repeated a consistent version when speaking to journalists, but scattered through his longer interviews and recorded conversations are small, practical details that matter far more today than ideological statements. He was not a policymaker or strategist. He stood in corridors, passed on messages, and manned the phones. That position was exactly what made him valuable. He noticed who carried what, when items were moved, and where tasks were carried out. It is this corridor-level record, unspectacular but precise, that gives his account its weight. In these accounts, Misch described what surrounded him in functional terms. He was in and out of offices, moving through the communication rooms, sometimes standing by doors where exchanges could be overheard. That gave him access to fragments of instruction, often mundane, but together they exposed how tightly the environment was controlled. By April 30th, the wider world above no longer mattered inside the bunker. Berlin was already overrun. Survival was not the question. What Misch saw instead was staff assigned to methodical tasks, designed to shape what traces would survive. He recalled hearing that not only were the bodies to be burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, but even textiles and furnishings touched by blood were singled out for destruction. Cushions, upholstery, and fabric, soaked in stains, were gathered separately and taken outside to the fires. These were jobs given to staff who should have been conserving strength, but were told instead to lift and transport ruined furniture through rubble-strewn exits. Misch did not describe it as ideology. He described it as labor he observed others performing because orders demanded it. It was the act itself that etched into his memory. Historians emphasize this distinction. Misch reported what happened, who carried objects, when items were destroyed, how the sequence unfolded. He did not speculate on why. The interpretation comes later, and it suggests these measures signaled not panic but calculation. Collecting fabric and insisting it be burned apart from bodies leans toward staging, toward removing even minor evidence that linked the dictator's end to human fragility. Misch made no claims of ritual or symbolism. He simply noted that cushions traveled the same path as corpses, and both ended in fire. Scholars connect those observations to a broader effort to control Hitler's image. The significance lies in what such details reveal about priorities in the midst of destruction. Ammunition was short, supplies scarce, and air almost unbreathable, yet orders still flowed about how a piece of furniture was to be handled. Misch remembered men bearing loads of fabric into the open, risking shellfire to place those remnants on flames already struggling with limited petrol. It is unlikely such precision was the product of chaos. The bodyguard's careful recollections pushed researchers to regard the last days as more orchestrated than older images of panic suggest. Misch's testimony also outlined the atmosphere among staff. He described exhaustion, irritability, and silence that hung over the rooms. No one appeared enthusiastic, but when these unusual tasks were ordered, they went ahead without protest. Misch believed this came less from loyalty and more from fear of deviating from orders even at this late stage. Those who worked the corridors did not debate meaning. They lifted objects, disposed of papers, carried fragments to burn. From his vantage point, the bunker emerges not as a place of random collapse, but as one where control was exerted down to the residue of blood on furniture. He recalled seeing papers shredded, clothing chosen for disposal, and small items removed with the same care as major documents. Misch's voice remained matter-of-fact. That is what made these statements useful. He did not quote them in dramatic language. He listed them like steps in a process. And for historians familiar with the gap between myth and verifiable action, such straightforward notes are telling. The image built from his words is not of Hitler commanding grand maneuvers, but of a leadership ensuring that even the smallest evidence of death and decay would not remain intact. The fires struggled to consume fully, but still every effort was made to feed them. If the petrol could not erase completely, then at least cloth and paper could be destroyed beyond recognition. Misch's repeated references to these tasks strengthened the interpretation that Hitler's death was framed deliberately, not left to chance. This has implications beyond the bunker itself. Testimony such as Misch's shows how information was managed internally, but outside forces would shape the narrative differently. The Soviets were the first major power to reach the sites of those fires. They did not just discover remains, they catalogued, argued, and concealed. What they found and how they chose to interpret it would dominate decades of speculation. The bodyguard's recollections stop at the threshold of that discovery. He noted the tasks, the movements, the sequence of disposal, but he was not witness to the Soviet investigation that came after. For that, historians turn to sealed files and later releases that detail what investigators confronted when they entered Berlin. Misch provides the final view from inside. What follows is how the outside world received and concealed those fragments. It is at this point that that the weight of disappearing evidence shifted from German hands into the hands of Soviet authorities, whose own secrecy added an entirely new layer to the mystery. Unmasking Soviet discoveries. In recent years, with new FSB releases and archival files made available in the mid-2020, researchers have uncovered Soviet documents and interrogation transcripts that reveal just how unsettled the Soviet leadership was in 1945 about what they had found in Berlin. These papers bring the internal hesitation into focus. They show that within days of recovering human remains from the garden of the Reich Chancellery, senior officers were corresponding in coded telegrams that reflected uncertainty, disagreement, and an unwillingness to announce that the body in their custody was without question Adolf Hitler. The telegram chains and interrogation notes recorded at the time help explain this caution. Field units reported that dental evidence had been retrieved, and dental staff who had worked for Hitler confirmed the unique patterns they recognized. The teeth were carefully separated from the rest of the remains, wrapped, and sent with urgency to verification teams. Commanders in Berlin relayed their findings with confidence, but the replies from Moscow were careful, almost deliberately non-committal. They asked for more reports, more tests, and more silence until senior officials gave approval. Rather than a decisive acknowledgement, what came back were requests for additional confirmation and repeated instructions to withhold public statements. The laboratory records from Berlin capture this process. Jaw fragments, skull pieces, and dental work were photographed, measured, and compared to earlier molds held in German files. Different sets of experts conducted examinations using chemical reagents, wax models, and microscopy. Each report logged methods and outcomes in detail, yet the phrasing remained cautious. Terms like consistent with or probable identity appear again and again. The science was strong enough to identify the remains, but the language stopped short of the certainty that would allow the leadership to release an official declaration. Archival evidence points to this restraint as political rather than scientific. Soviet doctors knew the evidence matched, but Stalin and those around him viewed the risk of error as catastrophic. If the regime announced Hitler's death and he later emerged elsewhere, their credibility would collapse. The documents suggest a culture in which suspicion overshadowed trust. Stalin feared being deceived, either by his enemies or even by his own military staff. At the highest levels, the response was contradictory. Confidence expressed privately met with orders for secrecy publicly. It was less about disbelief in the dental records than about political caution shaping how, or whether, the discovery would be shared. This secrecy had consequences. By locking away physical proof rather than showing it to their allies, the Soviets seeded doubt. Western intelligence soon noticed the inconsistency. Reports described Moscow privately asserting they had evidence, while in public Stalin hinted Hitler might have escaped. This contradiction encouraged speculation. Rumors circulated that the Soviets were hiding something more dramatic, perhaps even that Hitler lived on in another part of the world. Western services sometimes allowed such stories to spread. They underscored Soviet secrecy and deflected responsibility. The documents also reveal how thoroughly the Soviets managed their evidence. Orders were issued to store fragments under guard, to restrict access to only a few specialists, and to prevent discussion even with trusted Allied representatives. Over time, the fragments were hidden first in military archives, later in special KGB collections. Only a handful of officials saw them. Requests from Western governments in the late 1940s and 1950s to view the remains were flatly refused. This silence amplified suspicion. Without physical proof, even consistent eyewitness testimony from those inside the bunker struggled to carry full weight in the public mind. By the 1960s, when Cold War politics had hardened, the void created by Soviet secrecy was filling with invention. Books speculated about Hitler's escape, films imagined far-flung sightings, and television specials treated the survival myth as entertainment. The Soviets had achieved control of the evidence, but the price was the erosion of credibility. Secrecy became the soil in which conspiracies grew. The declassified files do not attempt to resolve the question of motive in a neat way, but they do show that caution at the top of the Soviet system explains the paradox. Stalin approached the problem with suspicion, instructing repeated testing and delaying acknowledgement. For him, political control outweighed scientific certainty. That choice shaped the narrative of Hitler's death for decades. The reports circulated internally describe a cycle. Commanders offered assurance, Moscow demanded more analysis, and official confirmation never came. Meanwhile, Stalin's briefings included comments reflecting distrust. He speculated his officers might unknowingly be fooled by German deception. This pattern had less to do with the science, which was straightforward, and more to do with the political climate of absolute control. Soviet leaders wanted to decide not only the facts, but also the timing and framing of those facts. As time passed, the evidence itself became a casualty of this secrecy. Locked away in Moscow, hidden from independent scientists, it turned into a symbol of mistrust. Even in later years, when the fragments were tested again and publicly identified, decades of concealment had conditioned people to see cover-up rather than clarity. Historians now emphasize that the Soviets created the very conditions that conspiracy theorists would later exploit. Had the evidence been shared openly in 1945 with British and American investigators, these myths may have struggled to take root. Instead, silence and secrecy ensured that counterfeit stories would endure. Today, researchers reviewing the interrogation transcripts and telegrams conclude that the Soviet Union's handling of the remains was less a scientific controversy than a political strategy. Stalin's insistence on control meant that certainty became impossible to broadcast. As a result, conspiracy theories that Hitler had escaped flourished in the gaps. Even though the material evidence consistently confirmed identity, the world outside never saw it. The files also underscore how decisions made in secret rooms became long-term historical forces. The Soviets intended to control the narrative, but the opposite occurred. By concealing what they had, they fueled decades of doubt, giving later popular culture and political rivals a ready source of speculation. These declassified documents close part of the record. They show how orders to silence and delay filtered from the top down, shaping what could and could not be said. But they also open another line of inquiry. While the Soviets built secrecy around the remains, others in Berlin were moving through hidden spaces without such control. Their actions, carried out beneath the city itself, added yet more layers to the story of those final hours.